Good evening and welcome to Hello It's Us, Perspectives on Inclusion. This program is dedicated to educating the general public about issues that are important to people with disabilities. And we hope and firmly believe that you'll discover that those very same issues are important to the general public, since people with disabilities are a part of the general public in this community and throughout the country. Hello It's Us is brought to you through a collaboration between the University of Iowa Center for Disabilities and Development, Uptown Bill's Coffee Shop, and the good people here at Public Access Television. My name is Mike Hoenig. I work for the Center for Disabilities and Development as a program coordinator, and I serve as co-host for Hello It's Us. Keith.
My name is Keith Ruff. I'm your other co-host. I'm retired now. And I'm very happy to say I finally have a prototype of the book I've been writing for 2 years. So we hope to have it out by December.
All right, it's going to happen. Well, we're really pleased to be discussing, this is the first of a two-part series on a very important topic to all of us, voting. It's hard to believe that we're at the midterms already, and so we're going to bring in some experts. We're actually filming on site at the Johnson County Auditor's office because we are going to, during the second portion of our series, give all of you a chance to glimpse an accessible voting machine. So you'll want to be tuned in next week for that as well. So I'd like to introduce our guest for today. Carrie Nierling is the Johnson County Deputy Auditor of Elections. So thanks for joining us, Carrie.
Thank you.
And Rick Shannon, who has driven all the way from Des Moines. So he's a public policy manager with the Iowa Developmental Disabilities Council. So welcome, Rick.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for making the trip over. So we'd like to start out and just ask the two of you to introduce yourselves, tell us a little bit about yourselves and what brought you into this area. In both of your cases, I believe that disabilities and election are kind of crossing paths and intersecting here.
Sure. I've been with the Johnson County Auditor's Office as a Deputy of Elections for about 3.5 years now. I don't know quite how I ended up in elections. Everybody who ends up in my position always says that they never really envisioned a career in elections, but somehow it happened. I have a political science background in college, so I think that kind of led me there. I just generally oversee the day-to-day operations of the elections department, and as part of that, am in charge of the accessibility, both with our voting equipment and also with our polling places. So there's a lot of, as Mike said, a lot of requirements with the Help Americans Vote Act over the last 15 years or so. So that's sort of where I intersect with accessibility issues in elections.
Great, thanks, Gary. Rick, how about you?
Yeah, I've been with the Iowa Developmental Disabilities Council for about 21 years now. Mike referred to Carrie and I as experts. I would prefer to think of Carrie as the expert when it comes to elections. But I do have a real passion for this subject, in large part because people with disabilities have been so significantly underrepresented as voters historically. So the council that I work for is a federally funded state agency. We are funded by the federal government to work at a systems and policy level for change that creates opportunities for people with developmental disabilities to live, learn, and work in the communities that they choose. I can't think of a more fundamental way to influence that kind of systems change that creates those opportunities than starting at the ballot box. And I think that's one of the reasons that we've been so passionate about the subject and working diligently like we do to educate potential voters with disabilities about the importance of getting involved.
Well, great. So, you know, we're gonna talk about some statistics in a little bit, but before, do you have any, I guess, so people know what your connection is with voting? You know, that certainly you've introduced yourself and why that's important. Would you like to talk a little bit further about ID Action at this point, or shall we jump into the kind of the statistics.
Yeah, I'd be happy to introduce ID Action. I'm sure that many of your viewers
Yeah.
know who we are or have heard of us, but Iowans with Disabilities in Action, that's the ID Action is the shorter name, but it's a project, it's actually a standalone 501c3, and the purpose of the 501c3 is to engender greater civic participation by people with disabilities. It is a project that's primarily funded by the Iowa Developmental Disabilities Council at this point. But as I mentioned, the purpose is to increase the civic participation of people with disabilities. We've been doing a really good job of transitioning people with disabilities from older, more antiquated forms of institutionalization. We've been moving people into communities, but I think a lot of people would tell you you can be just as isolated in a community as you can be in an institution. And so what we want to do is increase those opportunities for people to engage, to interact with others in the community, to really be invited and to feel welcome. And one of the ways, again, that we can do that is by participating in political situations, getting involved in elections, paying attention to the issues, paying attention to the candidates and where they stand on those types of issues. And I think one of the reasons that people with disabilities have been so underrepresented at the ballot box is for just those reasons. They don't have the information that they need, they don't have the confidence, and then of course there are issues related to accessibility, both the accessibility of the process. In some areas it might be accessibility to polling places or other information or resources that people need to develop that confidence.
And the only other way I know of voting, because I do it, is at the library.
Yes, we do have satellite locations, so in addition to voting on election day in our office, we are out in the community at various places, a lot of times at the library, at the University Hospital, and on campus, we usually will have a campus site as well, where people can vote in person, and any of those accessibility ways are available at our satellites as well.
Thanks, Carrie. I wanted to go back a little bit and touch on what Rick was talking about, just in terms of people with disabilities not having the confidence, and that's kind of when we started to plan this, and kind of the first fundamental question that we found to be most important is, why are we even having this discussion? Why are we dedicating an hour of everyone's time to talking about people with disabilities and voting? And I mean, obviously voting is important for everyone. But there are people with disabilities that just do not feel comfortable, as you said. Maybe it's a confidence, maybe they don't think that they can get to the polls, maybe they don't think their vote matters. But could you talk, either one of you, I know Rick, you shared some statistics about the underrepresentation of people with disabilities at the polls, and what size of a voting block and the power that we as people with disabilities have the potential to have.
Sure, and I think you mentioned the size of the voting block, and I do think that you raise a really significant point there. It's estimated that there are people living with a disability, so this includes people who are in ways, maybe they don't have a disability, but they have a family member or are somehow affected by disability in general, make up a voting block that's almost 62 million people. So I think when we consider that number, it really does lend credence to the fact that this is a significant number of people. They cross all kinds of other boundaries. They're people of different ethnicities. They're male, they're female, there are just no boundaries there. And so it is a large group of individuals. They have been historically disenfranchised in the election process. I do want to say that I think we have made some significant progress. When we started with the Iowans with Disabilities in Action project some 15 years ago, the disparity between voting rates among people with and without disabilities was close to 20% nationally. We've narrowed that pretty significantly over the years. In the 2016 election, it was estimated at about 6%. So, we obviously have made some significant improvements, but if you look at the numbers, they just don't bear that out. I mean, there's still almost half of the eligible voters with disabilities.
So in other words, the voting number in the 2016 was rather low.
Yeah, nationally, voter turnout, people without disabilities, voter turnout was about 62.2% overall. So that's a national figure. Voter turnout among people with disabilities was down to about 55.9%. So that's where you find that gap of 6.3%.
Okay.
Now, one thing I would like to add, our voter turnout rate in Iowa was higher than that national average. Voter turnout among people with disabilities was about the same, but our gap, our disparity between voter turnout rates was actually 8.6%. So we were actually turning out people with disabilities at the polling place in smaller numbers than we saw on a national level.
Carrie, in this county, did you notice anything in particular about the number of people voting?
Well, I think there was definitely, you will see in the 2016 presidential election, as generally in a general election, like the midterms coming up, there is a bigger push to get out the vote for the disabled community. So we saw a lot of emphasis on, curbside voting, and I think various organizations worked with the Seats Transit to bring people to the polling places on election day. So we did see a big emphasis in pushing that out. On our end, from the auditor's office, we don't really have any way of tracking the number of people, specifically in a demographic as far as disabled versus non-disabled. But we definitely saw a lot of community action trying to reach out to those people and let them know, hey, these are the various ways that you can get to the polls, that you can vote once you get to the polls, or you can vote at home and all of that. Because I do think that there's, maybe not a great deal of some of that, lower turnout could be attributed to the fact that they might not know that there are all these options available to them. And even if they do know, I think that there is definitely, an aspect of the lack of confidence. You go into a polling place and you're the only one maybe using that machine, and people might be looking at you and all of that. And what we've done to try to make that less so is we're encouraging other voters to use that accessibility machine as a kind of ballot marking device. So we have it at our fairs, and people are voting at it in our office and at some other elections and satellites. So everybody can use it. It's not just a machine that's used by disabled people. So it's not singling anybody out. Anybody can walk in and use it, and they're offering it to other people as well.
And I think that's an important point that Carrie brings up, the use of the machine, because I hear a lot from precinct election officials. I don't know why we have to have this equipment. It's for people with disabilities and nobody ever uses it. And so I think there's a sort of a public awareness component to that as well. Making sure that it is available, that it is accessible to everybody. And it becomes at that point just like an electronic door. Those are curb cuts, things like that. They all started as an accommodation for people with disabilities, but we all use them.
That's right. And we have found that, even every voter that has used our accessibility machine, they love them. They think it's the best thing ever. And it's like, they always ask, why do you only have one of these in the polling place? And it's like, well, they're expensive, but, if we could afford to have one for everybody, we would absolutely have more of them in the polling place, because they are really great. And we're glad that other people are experiencing that as well, and hope that makes it, I don't know, if, makes it less awkward maybe, for someone who does need to use it because of a disability to, approach it and ask to use it.
I think, just speaking from personal experience, you're so right, both of you on target about just the, getting it out there so that more people will use it. What I remember back when we were first we were working on the Help America Vote Act, and I went to I do not live in Johnson County, so this was not a Johnson County issue, but I do remember going to a hearing of some sort, and there were a lot of poll workers, and the county supervisors and everything. They were trying to determine how they were going to pay for the accessible machines. And I was approached, and somebody said that, do you realize that this is costing each precinct, whatever they were several $1,000s, the auto marks at the time. And, you do think about it's kind of stigmatizing. And then, the first couple of times I went to the polls, after the machines were purchased, the poll workers had not even turned the machines on. And so, it's gotten to the point now where they'll see me and say, okay, here's our one, I've heard things like, well, you're the only one using it, So, except for the last time I went to the 2016 election, I actually had to wait, and I was so excited because there was somebody with a visible disability in front of me, and the poll workers were there helping that person, and it just made me happy because I felt in some small way, that I had an impact on our county, and now here's somebody else besides me was actually using it, so that really did my heart good. But it's taken 15 years or thereabouts to make that happen.
Well, and the availability of these accessible machines actually was one of the outcomes of the Help America Vote Act that Carrie mentioned earlier, passed after the 2000 election. That was a federal law, required precinct polling places to have equipment that's accessible to people with disabilities. That equipment has evolved over the last 18 years. The equipment looks very different. It performs differently, although it has some basic core functions that are available on any of the machines. But the other reason that I like what they're doing in Johnson County with encouraging use by others of the machine is these machines were made available to give people with disabilities the right to cast an independent and private ballot. That you can't really put a price on that. You talked about poll workers talking about the cost of the machine. So many of these machines, I think Carrie will maybe talk about this when she does the demo, they produce a ballot that looks nothing like the ballot that most members of the general public are filling out. And in my mind, that's another reason to encourage widespread use of the machine, because Mike, if you're the only one in a precinct who uses that machine and it spits out a ballot that doesn't look like the one that the rest of us are using, it's going to be pretty easy to spot your ballot. And it really, you're no longer guaranteed that private independent ballot.
So true.
Rick, like Mike, I've noticed over the years, people with disabilities voting are still a little hesitant to vote in public, especially. What do you think we can do as a public to try to help people with disabilities get over that hump?
From my perspective and my work with Iowans with Disabilities in Action, what we have found is most valuable for people with disabilities, and this is what they tell us, is having the opportunity to access the information. So we do a lot of training, talking about the process, who is not eligible to vote. We talk about things like you already talked about, how can I vote? What are the different opportunities? Do I have to go to a polling place? But the thing that I believe people value more than anything is the opportunity when we presented the information to practice and to build some confidence in their ability to get through the polling process, whatever that looks like. So we actually own an accessible voting machine with the Iowans with Disabilities in Action project. When we go out and talk to people, we take that equipment with us. We give people a chance to practice. I know, Mike, you were around when the first auto marks, the first accessible voting equipment hit the state years ago, and we had one of those at that time, and I remember how impressed you were by the opportunity to spend some time on it, to get comfortable with it, and then, you know, you're certainly less intimidated when you go to the polling place.
And I remember, I think you were on the road trip, we went up to Minneapolis, there was some kind of a fair of some sort going on where they had all the different machines showcased. And then, so I had the opportunity to, and that was before, I think before a lot of Iowa counties had purchased equipment. It was early on. And then I remember a couple of years ago, Carrie, your office reaching out to me and to other disabled voters to come down and kind of check things out. And, you know, I do realize that not everybody has that opportunity, but, you know, I'm usually pretty good at just kind of learning on the fly. But I have to admit, it was a big, big advantage for me and for other voters with disabilities to go out and do that, because you actually get to interact with it and say it's really not that intimidating. I think that one of my biggest concerns was, you know, I think it does take longer. You have to listen to some instructions, and my concern was, oh geez, you know, everybody's gonna think I'm taking forever to vote. And I finally just got over that and said, hey, you know, whatever it takes, that's what I'm going to do. But yeah, you're absolutely right, Rick, that having some familiarity with the machine. But having said that, I think that those of you out there who are viewing, or maybe friends or family members or supporters of people with disabilities, if you haven't had that opportunity, there are a number of things. You know, you can certainly come to the poll, and they'll take as much time as you need. I would suspect, Carrie, that if they were to contact your office and want a demo, or just to come down and get familiar with the machine, would that be a possibility?
Yes, that's absolutely a possibility. And I know since we've gotten this equipment, we've had various conversations with certain groups, and you know, they've expressed, you know, at some time if they would like to come, and if we could come to their group, and we've kind of, you know, made it very open door as far as that's concerned. If they have an organization that has a meeting, and they think it would be helpful, where we would be happy to attend a meeting and bring our equipment there so that they could experience it, you know, in a different setting. We're more than happy to have someone come in the office. We always have, whenever we have early voting in our office, we always have the machine set up for anybody who would need it. But yeah, we are very welcoming and very happy to give anybody the opportunity to come in and experience it and practice on it, because I do agree that, you know, familiarity helps. It makes it so much easier, because you actually have that confidence when you go in that you know, okay, this is what I need to do.
We've got about 5 minutes, and I know that some of you that have tuned in, one of the more controversial subjects has been the voter ID changes of the law. So I'm hoping that between the two of you, you can bring some insight into what it says. I know there's also been an injunction. If we don't finish in 5 minutes, we'll pick this up, and it'll be a teaser for those of you to come back and watch next week. But just tell us a little bit about the law, and then what voters actually do need to bring with them to the poll if they're voting in person.
I guess I can lead off on that. What changed with the voter ID law is now voters will need to bring a photo ID of some sort. There are a few accepted forms: a driver's license, an Iowa driver's license, or an Iowa non-operator ID, or a U.S. passport, a U.S. military ID, or veterans ID are all acceptable, as well as for people who don't have an ID that's issued by the Department of Transportation, they were sent a card that has a PIN on it, and they can sign that. That's acceptable as well. It's not a photo ID, but that's acceptable because of that identification number on it. So that went into effect this year, that when you vote on election day in person, that you need to have that. However, throughout 2018, if you don't have that ID with you, a voter is able to sign an oath, basically attesting to what their identification is, who they are as a person, and that they're eligible to vote. And as long as they sign that throughout this year, which will include the election in November, if they sign that oath, then they're good to go. They're able to vote. As of January 1, that option is not going to be available. So that's a big component of the ID aspect of it that's in effect now. It does not change what you need to have if you're just registering to vote on election day. That's going to be the same. So that's kind of where that is. There were some changes also made to absentee voting in terms of requiring certain numbers, an identification number to be put on your absentee request form, and also enabling the auditor's offices to check for signature comparison, signature verification as they're returning back. That's something that was a subject of litigation, so both of those aspects are currently not being enforced. They're prohibited at this point. So you do not have to write any sort of identification number on your absentee ballot request form. You can if you choose, it's always an option, but you're not required to. And we will not be checking ballots to make sure their signatures match up. So those are not in effect because of the injunction. And another thing that the injunction did was to prohibit any sort of materials and being disseminated, or any sort of outreach or marketing, I guess, that says voter ID is required without specifically saying, but you can sign this oath, basically.
Okay.
And I'd like to go back to the voter ID card
Yes.
for just a moment, and be really clear, because there's so many questions out there about the new voter ID card, and why didn't I get one in the mail? And we hear this a lot from people with and without disabilities. Well, my voter ID card hasn't shown up yet. What does that mean? And so I want to be really clear. The only people who are getting that voter ID card are people who are registered to vote and who do not have already any sort of ID that's been issued by the Department of Motor Vehicles.
Oh.
So I'm not going to get a voter ID card because I have a current driver's license.
Okay.
Mike, you have a non-operator ID. You're
Right.
not going to get a voter card
Right.
as long as that ID is still valid. A voter ID card?
Yeah.
Oh, you did. So you will need well, now, for the satellite voting, will Keith need to, or not just Keith, but anyone going to vote, to have a satellite office, will they need to have that?
Nope, that was not, there was never any, with the new law, in-person early voting, whether it's satellite or in the office, there was never any requirement to show ID.
Interesting.
But you did have to, that was where you had to write that number on the request form, but now that's out the window too presently.
And I assume that's because when you go to a satellite or you vote in your office, you're actually voting an absentee ballot.
Right, and they can verify
Right.
things later, which is not
You know what,
possible.
Carrie, why don't you hold that thought, if you're going to share a little bit more about that, and that'll be a great place for us to pick up in week 2, and hopefully all of you will tune back in. This is a half hour has flown. I want to thank Rick and Carrie for taking the time to be with us today. And thank you for watching, and thank all of our sponsors for continuing to support us.
Have a good week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye now.